Hi folks, with Tassless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how the UK British Prime Minister is being likened to the murderous, brutal dictator of the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, Josef Stalin. What are the similarities, and how can we see the behavior of an ideological, arbitrary law, imposition of arbitrary law state, and compare that to the globalist satellites of today? Now, in the globalist order, or the globalist New World Order, they're imposing without the consent of the people. And it's an ideological sort of government they're imposing and have been imposing for some time. The law and the rules just get in the way, so they have to be got rid of. And the way that that's done is by converting the law from a factual, rules-based system into an arbitrary ideological system stacked with kangaroo courts, activists, and so on. I never thought it'd be possible to subvert the Western legal systems in the way that the globalists have done, and they've been stunningly successful in doing it. And of course, in so doing, removing a very key obstacle to the imposition of their ideological government. Ideological government is imposition without the consent of the people. So, so it's ideological rather than consensual. Now, what are the similarities? So we need to talk a little bit about Joseph Stalin. If you go to sort of school-age kids or even college kids, and you talk about the big mass murderers of all time, murdering their own citizens, no less. Then you mentioned Stalin's name. Oh yeah, I think I heard about that. Yeah. Oh, who was he again? Again, one of the great mass murderers of all time, and it happened within the last 100 years. You talk about Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong in China. Most people don't know. They'll unless they specifically studied that, they'll look at you, no idea. You talk about Pol Pot, nah, never heard of him. Who the fuck's he? And the list goes on. But you mentioned Hitler's name, every head turns, everybody knows. Now, they don't know anything about Hitler, like what has he done, where did he come from, what did he do? But they don't know any details or any facts. But the one go-to, if you're going to talk about, the epitome and the great manifestation of evil through mass murder, then Hitler is the only one who's known universally. Even retarded people know Hitler's name. I think I mentioned this before. I was at a sports event with some friends of ours, and they've got a mentally handicapped daughter who's got an IQ 60 or something, and she drools, and it's pretty bad. They brought her along, and there was the teams were coming out, and the German team came out, and the team from Germany, and so she looked at me while she was drilling, by the way, and she looked at me, oh, Germany, and then she sort of put this drooling smile on her face, and, oh, Hitler. Even she knows Hitler. So Hitler's the go-to, but Hitler actually is well down the list when it comes to mass murder. Similarly, Hitler didn't murder his own citizens. He was much keener to murder other citizens than the German ones, whereas Stalin ruthlessly murdered his own citizens, as indeed did Chairman Mao, as indeed did Pol Pot, and the list goes on. So, Stalin was born in, I think it was 1878. I'm going off the top of my head there. I think it was 1878. He was born in the state of Georgia, which is south of Russia. It's not even a Russian state, actually. South of Russia, in and around the Caucasus Mountains, there in that isthmus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So it's sort of north of Turkey, south of Russia would be its position there. And I think it's got the Black Sea on one side and the Caspian Sea on the other. Now, and it's quite a mountainous region. So Stalin came from there. He was a communist, or Bolshevik as they call them back then, communist agitator in Russia. Now, the Soviet Union, as it came to be, really was what the Russian state used to call the Tsar, the emperor was emperor of all the Russias. So they used to, Ukraine and Georgia and Belarus and, Siberia, all that sort of stuff, Kazakhstan and the like. They were referred to as little Russias. So the Tsar was emperor of all the Russias. That was really what formed the Soviet Union once the Bolshevik government seized power at the point of a gun. So from the time the communist government was installed in the Soviet Union, as it became known, it was never consensual. It was only a very small group of people went along with it, and they seized the government and the post office and the telegraph, that type of stuff, and through that seized power. It was a civil war, a brutal civil war. Millions died, and then the Bolsheviks sort of had cemented their control by 1921, 1922, and then quite ruthlessly went about imposing their will on the. Now they knew that the people weren't interested in, didn't go along with it. There were vast, huge sections of the the Russian and the wider sort of the Russias plural community that didn't go along with what the Bolsheviks wanted to do, imposition of a communist government without the consent of the people. Now, Russia had always been a reasonably isolated and paranoid place. You still see that in the people today, coming out of that part of the world, and they, as indeed you do in Eastern Europe, and they didn't really go along with the Soviet system, now the communist system, but the government was ideological, and what they viewed was that anyone that opposed, disagreed with, or questioned the communist system, they were the real enemies. They were the danger. People that committed murder or robbery or this or that, no. That's small potatoes. The real issue is the ideological issues. And people disagree with us. They're either currently or potentially could be, or might convince others to be opponents of, or to be less enthusiastic about the communist regime. And this is the problem with ideological governments. They view questioning or disagreement as being an attack. It's the most heinous attack on them. So they refer to anyone like as enemies of the people, counter-revolutionaries, fascists. And fascist was a popular term even around then, or certainly into the 1920s, to accuse people who simply disagreed with the communist system. Now, there's a lot to disagree about. The mass movement of people from the countryside, because Russia was still primarily an agrarian society at the time, moving them into the cities to try and create an industrial society, and also to force people to work in factories, which was quite new. Very few people actually worked in factories at the time, but these were people who were taken, peasants, directly out of the countryside, and then were forced to work in factories. Now, the communists had this thing about education, that if everyone could read and write, then we can ply them with propaganda. So they had this unusual balancing act where they had to have literate people, otherwise they couldn't read the propaganda, but they had to be dumb literate. And so they wanted this combination of dumbness but literate. So everyone had to go to school, to learn to. This was heralded at the time by people as so enlightened. The education, and you still see it in leftist politicians today. And they call themselves I'm the education president, and this sort of stuff, as if they were lifting people out of illiteracy and so on. But that doesn't apply today. So it's quite absurd. If a politician is committed to education, now what it means is that everyone should be given an affirmative action PhD. That'll make an equal society. Well, so Stalin anyway was a fairly junior player. So Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, people like that, they were at the Molotov. They were at the sort of more at the front end of the Bolshevik Revolution, particularly Lenin and Trotsky, and they were the sort of the thinkers and the guys who'd really done the heavy lifting, in the early, and then they had often fallen foul of the authorities, the Tsarist authorities. But they were now in charge, and they were ruthless in their application of power, and again imposing an ideological government. So what are the obstacles to imposing an ideological government? Well, the people maybe don't want it, so you kill them or imprison them. But anyone that you still have to have this veneer of legitimacy. So people that disagree with you, you need to accuse them of something. Far right, fascist, Nazi. You still have to accuse them of something, and so you drag them into ideological courts. Excuse me, and then you put them into prison or you kill them. Now, this was interesting for Lenin, because Vladimir Lenin had been a sort of a Bush, a Bush lawyer, and so he knew how the law worked and he knew what the law was, and it's surprising that somebody like that would be so on board with the wholesale abandonment of the rule of law or due legal process in particular. Now, the worst was yet to come, but Lenin and if you look at Trotsky, a Jewish intellectual, very committed to the principles of revolution, who fell out with Stalin, by the way, later on. But he was of the view that well, just kill people who don't agree with you. The people who left will agree with you, and the people who don't agree with you, once they see the other folks getting shot, they'll very quickly fall in line and will agree with you. Now, in those days, especially during the Civil War and the aftermath, life was very cheap, so killing people was done quite casually and carelessly. This did change sort of, in the decades to come, but not a whole lot. Now, Stalin was really just a sort of an office manager come paper pusher guy originally. Given his limited education, that seems a bit odd, but he seemed quite diligent. He'd work until the late hours of the night under candlelight and so on, and he was very good at appointing loyalists into key positions, and running just the secretarial paperwork, admin functions in the back room, and things that Lenin and Trotsky didn't really care about. And there were some sort of communist intellectual visionaries like the Bukharins and that sort of thing that were there, and they too didn't care about this. So Stalin ended up amassing a lot of power. So by 1924, 25, he kind of after Lenin had died, and Lenin had a couple of strokes beforehand, Stalin had pretty much was running the government at this point. And by 1927, he was formally declared as the General Secretary, which was the title they gave to, in effect, the guy in charge. Now, they had sort of titular positions like presidents, but they were quite ceremonial, really. The General Secretary was the guy in charge, and they were the chairman of the Politburo Committee. That's the supreme ruling body of the Soviet Union. So they were the ones making decisions. Now, the Politburo technically could outvote the chairman, but in the days of Stalin, if you defied Stalin, he'd have you killed, under bullshit charges, of course. And this is very much a central part of how the government imposed its will, the communist government imposed its will, and how it kept control. Arbitrary law, vague arbitrary law, and their main concern, their primary concern, there was a secret police, which you see in Britain now, going over all the tweets and postings online, to ferret out those people that disagree with the globalist project, and then send them to prison on the way. You intended to do Nazi things or something. So this was very much how the government operates. So this is the similarity with Starmer, the kangaroo courts, arbitrary law, arbitrary arrest, and so on. The second similarity, and this is Alexander Solzhenitsyn commented on this, is if you're a murderer, they don't really care. If you're a robber, they don't really care, as long as you don't rob a party official or something. But they don't really care if you commit sort of crimes, as in what we would typically call crimes. But they did very much care about ideological crimes. So if someone said they heard you over, talking about how the government was hopeless or useless, or that communism was bad, or anything like that at all, then you could be whipped off to prison, and you're an enemy of the people. And once they gave you that you're a Nazi fascist enemy of the people, then you effectively had no legal rights. if you were a murderer, you did have legal rights, but if you were against the ideology, you had no legal rights. Now, Stalin went about getting rid of, he looked at classes of people, groups of people who he thought, well, these people will never really be on board with the communist system. I can't convert them to my way of thinking, as in the communist way of thinking. So I might as well just kill them off. So, millions of Ukrainians, it's called the Holodomor, and millions of Russians and other people around the wider sort of Soviet empire were killed off by the tens of millions. And Stalin would sign, he'd start in the morning, and he'd be signing death warrants right through until the night. And and he loved playing games with people, particularly political opponents. He'd send the secret police around to arrest them, and they would arrest me for what? And they would, because they were senior members of the government, they would call Stalin directly and say that, what's going on? And Stalin would then go, well, this is outrageous. There must be a mistake. But this was his warning. This was his way of warning people. I can kill you anytime I want. For any reason I think up. I can dream up I don't need a reason, and I can take you out the back and have you shot. That sort of thing, which is very much how you see it in the UK today. You made a tweet that, you made an online posting that may have offended somebody. We don't have to tell you what the posting is, or but we can put you in prison for it, or even if you fight it and successfully, win the case, we can financially bankrupt you from it. That type of stuff. So it's either imprisonment or psychological and financial harassment undertaken by the state, just because you don't agree with the globalist project, not because you've committed a crime. And there are all sorts of little tripwires of hate speech and that are littered around. Same as in the Soviet Union, enemy of the people, the counter-revolutionary, and that sort of stuff. And they could go after anyone they wanted, but tens of millions died. And now Stalin died of a stroke in 1954. But what were his accomplishments? Now, the people on the sort of the communist end of the scale, so okay, well, tens of millions of people died, and okay, well, that's kind of not so good. But Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union. He industrialized it in the space of 15 years. He industrialized it at breakneck speed. Factories opening up left, right, and centre, and this sort of thing. And these factories weren't efficient. They didn't produce quality goods or anything, but they were numerous when at the end of the exercises through Soviet 5-year plans. And again, vast numbers of people being moved against their will, vast numbers of people being killed, as in tens of millions, the most brutal and brutish treatment you can imagine. People working in dirt floor factories, propaganda everywhere that women break off the chains of the kitchen and your evil husband, go and work in this dirt floor factory for 12 hours a day, 6 days, this sort of stuff. So this was Stalin wanted to transform, and did transform, the society from an agrarian to an industrial society, from a rural to an urban society, and instilled, the most fear and terror in people. Now, when Stalin died, many people I don't know how serious this is, it seems to be, and thousands of people filed past his coffin, and they saw him as a great leader. There seems to be a Russian sort of tradition that they revered the Tsar, but no matter how bad things got, they would say, well, the Tsar is, they would keep the Tsar in a state of reverence, or viewed with reverence. They would just say, well, he's surrounded by evil advisors. The evil advisors, they give him the wrong advice, and they cheat him, and they don't. They're not honest with him, and they lead him astray. And so the evil advisors, they're the ones. The evil advisors are the ones. The Tsar is omnipotent, and they seem to treat Stalin this way. That Stalin was really this omnipotent great leader, a Tsar, as it were. And any shortcomings or any the millions that died, and I think it's just Stalin's evil advisor. If Stalin had known what they were doing, he'd have stopped it. And political prisoners that were being arrested and and thrown into prison for nothing. Many of them didn't believe that Stalin could be the one that had signed their death warrants. So they would sit in prison writing letters to Stalin, Comrade Stalin, do you know what these people are doing? And the reality was, of course, it was Stalin all along, but it certainly surprised me looking at the histories, whether you're looking at Solzhenitsyn or history like Isaac Deutsche or others that wrote about Stalin, just how he was able to present himself as this great omnipotent leader, and that all the evil things were done, and no one disputed the evil things that were being done, were all carried out by his henchmen somehow without his knowledge. If he was that omnipotent and he knew nothing about tens of millions of people being killed, that would surely disqualify him from being a great leader, so you would think. But these are the similarities with Stalin and Starmer. Now, I should add that any ideological government does the same thing, whether it's Chairman Mao or Pol Pot. They have to invent these categories of crime which make it very easy for them to arrest and imprison or kill, as the case may be, people that don't agree with them, or may put out information which they would now call misinformation, disinformation, put information out there about that may oppose the globalist program. So that's really what it's all about. Starmer, being a globalist employee, is there to implement the globalist program. People that oppose or question the globalist program are to be taken out and destroyed, financially bankrupted, imprisoned, terrorized. It doesn't matter. And when you get police knocking on the door, then you're being terrorized if you've committed no crime and they can't even tell you what the crime is. So those are the similarities. I mean, it hasn't got to the point where people are being killed yet, but the British people, the indigenous population, are being replaced. There is breakneck mass migration without the consent of the people. People are getting irritated and annoyed by that. If you get irritated and annoyed, then you are opposing the globalist project. That makes you an ideological enemy, which means you go the fuck to prison, buddy. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.